Hi and welcome to section 6 on maintaining components. In this section we will take a look at some important aspects that help maintain components, like writing automated tests as well as techniques for debugging components. Now let's move on to the first video of this section. In this video we will specifically look at how to write a proper unit test for Angular 2 components. We will cover Karma, Jasmine, and talk about Angular 2 specific constructs like inject and inject async, the TestComponentBuilder, and ComponentFixture. So automated testing is an important factor for creating maintainable components and applications. Misko, the father of Angular, has always been a big promoter of testing, which was highly reflected in Angular 1 already. Same holds for version 2. Okay, let's give it a look. So we are going to focus on unit testing in this video, and specifically we cover unit testing of components, as that's the core topic of this video series. So as an example, we will take our modal dialog, which we created earlier in this video series, and add a test case for it. But first of all, we need to be able to run our tests. And there are two main tools that have become popular in the JavaScript community. The first one is Karma. It is for running and coordinating different browser instances, and it coordinates basically the test run and the browser communication. The next one is Jasmine, which is basically a behavior-driven assertion library, which allows us to write unit tests in a certain kind of way. Also, as a good starting point with Angular 2 and Karma is Julie Ralph's repository. Julie is an Angular 2 core member and is in charge of everything about testing. She's also the one that's actively working on the Protractor project, which is a Selenium-based UI testing tool for Angular. And her repository, the ng2 test seed, contains some quite valuable information on how to set up Karma unit tests for Angular 2. Also, you might take a look at the Angular 2 starter projects, which we encountered in our previous section, because there inside, for example in the Angular 2 seed project, there are a lot of test cases already written which contain valuable information on how to get started. Great, so for our example, I have taken the Angular 2 seed project from Minko Getchev, and as you can see, there is already a Karma configuration here ready for us, so we don't have to do that. And also, if you open up the package.json file, we see there is already a test script there which we can execute for running our tests. So what we are going to do now is to create a new spec file for our modal component, and we call it modal.component, and we suffix it with .spec.ts. That way Karma will automatically understand that this is a test file and execute it during our test run. So let's quickly paste in the scaffold of our test case. So as you can see, we import a couple of statements here. These are basically for running our unit test with Jasmine, and as you can see, they are already embedded in the Angular 2 testing package. Next, we import our modal dialog component, which we are going to test here. Finally, I always tend to create a failing test to see whether the setup works properly and our test is being executed, just as we expect. So we can then run the test case with npm test, and this will then compile the project and execute our tests using Karma. As you can see, it opens up Chrome, and here we get the nice report about our test that is obviously failing just as we expected. So to be able to better test our modal component, we are going to instantiate it by using it within another component, a so-called test component, which we simply create here at the end of this file. And this allows us to observe and thus test our modal component's behavior. Okay, then let's also adjust the name of our test into a meaningful one. And as mentioned, the scope of this test case here is to test and verify whether the content projection we implemented using the ng content works properly. So next we need to import a couple of things from Angular 2 testing. First of all, inject async. The other import is the TestComponentBuilder. This is a crucial class when it comes to testing components, as it lets us interact with them in a variety of useful ways, and we will immediately see how. So next we need to tell inject async to inject the TestComponentBuilder instance and take it as a parameter to our test function. Just note that this inject async is subject to be changed in the final release of Angular 2. So currently, at the moment I'm creating this video here, there is a pull request open which is going to refactor and change the name of that inject async into async simply. Okay, so now we can use our TestComponentBuilder and the according create async function for instantiating our test component which we created at the end of this file. So components are always created asynchronously, and that's basically the reason why we need all those asyncs here in this test setup. So in the callback of the create async, we get the fixture, which is an instance of a ComponentFixture object. And this fixture allows us to do nice things like accessing the native elements of our component. So in our case, we would like to access the native element, the native DOM element of our modal component. By using the debug element and in accessing the children of the debug element, we can get hold of the native element. So the debug element is basically our test component, and the children here are our modal dialog DOM element here. Okay, let's then add some assertions by inspecting our native element, which we just referenced. And for that we import the DOM from the Angular 2 platform. And this is basically an abstraction layer for getting access to the underlying native element. This is always suggested whenever you render on the server side or on other potential platforms where you don't have an actual DOM underneath. So through that DOM object you can basically abstract a querying mechanism. So finally we can use that query selector all function on our modal element, which we got previously, and then get hold of the h1 and body tag. And finally we can use the expect function to assert whether the h1 and div body text content matches our expectations. If we then run our tests, we see that we get a running and passing test. Okay, it gets even better. So we can not only interact with the DOM element, but we can also interact with the components API. So let's quickly add another test. And this time we basically want to verify that whenever we call the open function on our modal dialog, the isOpen flag internally should be set to true or false. So we again use that fixture and access the debug element and the children. But this time, rather than accessing the native element, we access the component instance property. This is basically the representation of an instance of our modal dialog component. We can now use that instance and simply invoke the open function, and finally use again the expect function to assert whether the isOpen is truthy. Again, if we run our tests, we see that they successfully pass. Next, let's test the fact that our modal dialog background is shown and hidden properly. Again, we create a new test case with the same setup from before. We again get hold of the instance and also of the native element. Then as a first step we invoke again the open function, and then we add the expect statements that the isOpen is truthy, and also by querying the DOM again we want to have the MD backdrop to be shown, so basically not to be hidden. We simply replicate the same for the closing again. So we use the DOM again to get hold of the button within the modal dialog. Then we click that button, which should then close our modal. And consequently, our modal dialog's isOpen should be false, and also the backdrop should be hidden. Now if we run those tests, we see that strangely this test fails now. And the reason here is that we are updating the HTML template of our component. And for this to work, we need to invoke Angular's change detect mechanism. So again, this is a function on our fixture, on our ComponentFixture object. So we can simply insert a fixture.detect changes after we open our modal dialog, and similarly we insert a fixture.detect changes when we close our modal dialog again. So we need to invoke that fixture.detect changes whenever we are going to change some property which has an effect on our template, so like regions are being hidden or shown. Now if we run the tests again, they should all pass properly. So obviously there are much more concepts to be explored which won't fit in this video, so we basically focused only on the testing of the component, and we only explored some basic mechanisms that help you get started. There are much more things to explore on the official Angular docs, so if you go for instance to the TestComponentBuilder and browse through the API, you can see functions like override template, override view, or even override directive, and these will help you test more complex components and Angular directives. Also taking a look at the component fixture, as you can see the various instance members like the bug element, the component instance, native element, and also functions like the detect changes which we have used today. Awesome! So in this video you learned some of the basics for getting started with unit testing Angular 2 components. Our focus was mainly on testing components, where we learned how to test changes in HTML as well as the component API.